Before we begin these bone-chilling tales, I need you to do something important. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear happened to real priests in real places, and some of these villages. They're still out there, waiting. Only 30% of viewers are subscribed, and your support helps us uncover more of these terrifying true encounters. Now prepare yourself for 12 stories that will change how you see abandoned places forever. Now get ready. Let's start story 1. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you, because now you're going to die of fear. The autumn of 1989 brought more than just changing leaves to the hills surrounding Harper's Mill. It brought me face to face with something that still haunts my dreams 34 years later. I was fresh from seminary then, 26 years old, and burning with the kind of righteous certainty that only comes with youth and inexperience. When the bishop assigned me to investigate reports of unusual phenomena in the ruins of Mercy Village, I thought it would be a simple case of overactive imaginations and local folklore. Mercy Village had been abandoned since 1957, when the last family finally gave up trying to make a life in what had become a place of inexplicable sorrow. The official records were sparse: economic decline, failed harvests, the usual reasons small communities withered away. But the unofficial stories, the ones whispered in the bars and general stores of Harper's Mill, painted a darker picture. People spoke of nights when the wind carried voices from the empty village, prayers that seemed to seep from the very ground itself. I remember the drive there vividly. October 31st, 1989, Halloween. Though I didn't realize the significance at the time. The narrow dirt road wound through dense forest, maple and oak trees ablaze with red and gold. As I drove deeper into the woods, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees and my breath began to fog the windshield despite the car's heater running full blast. When I first laid eyes on Mercy Village, my heart sank. The place wasn't just abandoned. It felt abandoned by God himself. Skeletal remains of houses dotted the landscape like broken teeth, their roofs caved in, their windows gaping black holes that seemed to watch my approach. In the center of it all stood the church, or what was left of it. The steeple had collapsed decades ago, leaving jagged wooden spears pointing accusingly at the gray sky. But it was the silence that unnerved me most. Not the peaceful quiet of a forest glade, but an oppressive, suffocating absence of sound that pressed against my eardrums like cotton. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, as if the very air was thick with something unseen. As I approached the church ruins, that's when I heard them. The whispers. At first I thought it was just the wind moving through the broken timbers, but as I stood still and listened, I began to make out words, Latin words, prayer fragments. Pater noster qui es in caelis. The Lord's Prayer, spoken by dozens of voices in perfect unison, yet so faint I had to strain to hear them. My hands trembling, I pushed open the church door. The hinges screamed in protest, a sound so sharp and sudden that I jumped backward. Inside, the floorboards were rotted through in places, and fallen beams created a maze of obstacles. The altar somehow remained intact, a simple wooden table covered in decades of dust and debris. That's where I found it, the diary. It lay open on the altar as if someone had just been reading it, though the dust patterns around it suggested it had been undisturbed for years. The leather cover was cracked with age, and the pages were yellow and brittle. But the ink was still dark, still legible, as if the words had been written yesterday. The first entry was dated September 15th, 1957. They won't stop screaming. Every night the screaming starts at midnight and doesn't end until dawn. Father Morrison says we must pray harder, that our faith is being tested. But I've seen things that prayer can't explain away. The shadows move wrong here. They move against the light. I flipped through more pages, my pulse quickening with each entry. September 20th. Found Mrs. Henderson this morning, standing in her garden, staring at nothing. When I called her name, She turned to me and her eyes were completely black. She smiled and said, "They're coming back. The first ones are coming back." September 25th. The children have stopped speaking. All of them. They just stand in groups, holding hands, staring at the old cemetery. When their parents try to move them, they resist with inhuman strength. The final entry, dated October 1st, 1957, was written in a shaky hand. "We're leaving tomorrow, all of us." Father Morrison tried to perform an exorcism on the village itself last night. We found him this morning in the cemetery, aged 30 years overnight, his hair white as snow. He keeps saying the same thing over and over. "They were here first. They were always here first. God forgive us. We should never have built on this ground." As I read those final words, the whispers around me grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with growing horror that they weren't coming from outside the church. They were coming from beneath it. The realization that the voices were coming from below the church floor sent ice through my veins. I looked down at the worn wooden planks beneath my feet, and for the first time, I noticed they weren't nailed down properly. Several boards were loose, as if they'd been pried up recently and hastily replaced. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I knelt and worked my fingers under one of the loose boards. It came up easily, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow my flashlight beam. The whispers immediately grew louder, now clearly audible, as human voices speaking in Latin, English, and languages I couldn't identify. "Help us," came a woman's voice, clear as crystal. "Please, Father, help us." I aimed my flashlight into the opening and nearly dropped it in shock. Below the church was a chamber I'd never read about in any historical record. Stone walls stretched down about 8 feet, and carved into those walls were dozens upon dozens of names. But these weren't memorial carvings. They were scratched into the stone as if by desperate fingernails, some still dark with what looked like dried blood. My theological training warred with my common sense. Everything in me said to replace the board, walk away, and report this as a simple case of local superstition. But the voices below were so plaintive, so desperate that I couldn't ignore them. These people, these souls, had been crying out for help for over 30 years. I lowered myself into the chamber, my feet touching solid stone. The walls were covered not just with names, but with symbols I recognized from my studies of pre-Christian religions. Spirals, interlocking circles, crude figures that seemed to writhe in my flashlight beam. This place was old, far older than the church above. In the center of the chamber sat a well. Not a water well, but something else entirely. The stones around its rim were black with age and stained with substances I didn't want to identify. As I approached, the whispers became almost deafening, a chorus of voices begging, pleading, warning. "Don't let them out!" A man's voice suddenly cut through the others, sharp with terror. "For God's sake, don't let them out!" But another voice, a child's voice, sobbed. "Please, we've been trapped so long. We just want to go home." I knelt beside the well and shone my light down into its depths. What I saw there defied all rational explanation. Faces. Dozens of faces, pressed against what appeared to be a surface just below the rim, like people trapped under ice. They were the faces of the villagers. I recognized some from old photographs I'd seen in Harper's Mill's Historical Society, but they hadn't aged. The man who disappeared in 1957 looked exactly as he had the day he vanished. As my light hit them, their mouths opened in silent screams, their hands pressed against the barrier that held them. And I understood with horrible clarity what had happened to Mercy Village. The people hadn't left. They'd been taken, pulled down into whatever lay beneath this ancient site, trapped in a space between life and death. "You have to choose, Father," came a new voice, deeper and infinitely older than the others. "Free them all, or leave them all. But know this, if you free them, you free everything else that's been imprisoned here, things that were old when your God was young." I stared into that well, at those desperate faces, and felt the weight of an impossible decision crushing down on me. The diary had mentioned that the village was built on cursed ground, but I was beginning to understand it wasn't cursed. It was a prison, and the church hadn't been built to serve God. It had been built as a seal. My hands shaking, I reached into my bag and pulled out my holy water. As the first drops hit the surface of the well, the temperature in the chamber plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the stone walls. The faces below became more agitated, pressing harder against their prison. But now I could see other things moving in the depths behind them, things with too many teeth, too many eyes, shapes that hurt to look at directly. "Choose!" the ancient voice commanded, and I felt a pressure in my mind like claws digging into my thoughts. I had seconds to decide. Free the innocent souls trapped below and risk unleashing something far worse, or leave them to their eternal torment to keep the world safe. Either choice would damn me, but only one would damn everyone else. The holy water bottle felt impossibly heavy in my trembling hands. The moment stretched into eternity as I stared into that well of souls, holy water poised in my shaking hand. The faces of the villagers pressed against their prison, eyes wide with desperate hope, while behind them ancient horrors writhed in anticipation of freedom. Then I heard it, a single clear voice rising above the chaos. A child, no more than 6 years old, singing "Jesus Loves Me" in a pure, sweet tone that cut through my terror like a blade of light. It was then I realized what I had to do. I began to pray. Not the formal Latin of my training, but the simple words my grandmother had taught me as a boy. "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." As I spoke, I poured the holy water not into the well, but around its rim, creating a circle of blessed water that began to glow with soft, warm light. The ancient voice roared in fury. "Fool! You understand nothing!" But I continued praying, and something miraculous happened. The trapped villagers began to rise, not freed from their prison, but transformed by it. They passed through the barrier that had held them like mist through glass, their forms becoming translucent, peaceful. The child who had been singing reached me first, her small hand touching my face with warmth that felt like sunlight. "Thank you, Father," she whispered. "We couldn't leave without forgiveness. We couldn't rest knowing others might follow." One by one, the villagers rose from the well, but they didn't flee. Instead, they turned and began to sing, a hymn I'd never heard, but somehow knew by heart. Their voices grew in power and harmony, and with each note, the things lurking in the depths below retreated further into the darkness. "You see," said an elderly man I recognized as the village pastor from old photographs, "we weren't trapped by evil. We were holding it back. Generation after generation, we chose to stay, to keep the seal strong with our sacrifice. But we grew tired, Father. We lost faith. That's when the seal weakened, when the whispers began to leak through. The truth hit me like a physical blow. The villagers hadn't been victims. They'd been guardians. They'd known what lay beneath their home and had willingly stayed to keep it contained, even after death. But doubt and despair had weakened their resolve, and the ancient evil below had begun to stir. "Will you stay, Father?" the pastor asked. "Will you help us maintain the watch?" I looked around at their expectant faces. These souls who had sacrificed everything to protect a world that had forgotten them. "How?" The child smiled, and in that smile was wisdom beyond her years. "Not forever, Father. Just until we can teach others. The seal is stronger when faith is freely given rather than forced by circumstance." I nodded, understanding flooding through me. This was why I'd been called here, why the bishop had sent specifically me. Over the following months, I would return to Mercy Village again and again, each time bringing other priests, seminary students, theologians who could understand the magnitude of what we faced. We established a rotation, a modern version of the ancient watch the villagers had kept. Each month, a different priest would spend 3 days at Mercy Village, praying, strengthening the seal, ensuring that what lay beneath remained contained. The villagers, finally at peace, knowing their burden was shared, began to fade one by one into whatever rest awaited them. The last to leave was the child. She appeared to me on my final solo visit to the village, her form now barely visible in the afternoon sunlight. "The others are waiting for me," she said simply. "Will you remember us, Father? Will you tell people that sometimes the scariest places are scary for good reasons?" I promised I would, and she smiled once more before disappearing like morning mist. The village fell silent then, truly silent for the first time in decades, but it wasn't the oppressive silence I'd first encountered. It was peaceful, watchful, protective. Today there's a small retreat center where Mercy Village once stood. Priests and seminary students come there to pray and study, not knowing they're part of an ancient vigil. The well beneath the old church site has been sealed with blessed concrete, and fresh holy water is sprinkled over it monthly. The whispers have stopped, but the watch continues, because some things are too dangerous to forget, and some responsibilities are too important to abandon. The villagers of Mercy taught me that true faith isn't about never being afraid. It's about being afraid and choosing to stand guard anyway. And sometimes on quiet autumn nights when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear that little girl singing "Jesus Loves Me" in the distance, a reminder that some souls shine brightest in the darkest places. Now get ready, let's start story 2. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you, because now you're going to die of fear. Winter came early to Vermont in 1994, blanketing the countryside in snow by late October and sealing the mountain roads until spring. It was during this harsh winter that I first heard about the midnight congregation of St. Bartholomew's from Father McKenna, an elderly priest who'd served the rural parishes for over 40 years. "Every night at midnight," he told me over whiskey by his fireplace, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he raised his glass. "Every single night for the past 15 years, that church fills with voices, singing hymns, reciting prayers, conducting full mass. But when morning comes, there's not a single footprint in the snow." I was young then, 32, and assigned to the Diocesan Investigation Department. My job was to look into reports of miracles, unexplained phenomena, and what the church diplomatically called unusual spiritual manifestations. Most cases turned out to be misunderstandings, natural phenomena, or sometimes elaborate hoaxes. But Father McKenna wasn't the type to fabricate stories. St. Bartholomew's sat in the ruins of Grimhaven, a village that had thrived in the 1800s but was abandoned after a diphtheria outbreak in 1903. The church, built from local granite, was the only structure that remained largely intact. According to parish records, the last official service had been held there in 1902, a funeral for the village's final resident. "The strange thing is," Father McKenna continued, "people have tried to attend. 3 different times over the years, folks have hiked up there on winter nights, drawn by the singing. But the moment they approach the church, the voices stop. The doors are locked, the windows are dark, and there's no evidence anyone was ever there." Against his strong advice, I decided to investigate. On December 21st, the winter solstice, I made the treacherous journey to Grimhaven. The snow was waist-deep in places, and the wind cut through my heavy coat like razors. By the time I reached the village ruins, it was nearly 11 p.m., and the temperature had dropped to well below zero. St. Bartholomew's loomed before me, its Gothic spire stabbing into the star-filled sky. The building was in remarkable condition for its age. The roof was intact, the windows unbroken, and the heavy oak doors showed no signs of weathering. It was as if the church existed in its own pocket of preserved time. I positioned myself behind a stone wall about 50 yards away and settled in to wait. The cold was brutal, seeping through my boots and gloves until I couldn't feel my fingers or toes. 11:30 came and went with no sign of activity. At 11:45, I began to wonder if Father McKenna had been mistaken. Then, at exactly 11:58, I saw light beginning to glow through the stained glass windows, soft at first, like candle flames, but growing steadily brighter. My heart began to race as I watched the church slowly illuminate from within, warm yellow light spilling out onto the snow. At precisely midnight, the singing began. The sound was incredible. Dozens of voices raised in perfect harmony, singing Silent Night in Latin. The melody carried across the frozen landscape with impossible clarity, each note crisp and pure in the frigid air. I could distinguish individual voices, a soprano so beautiful it brought tears to my eyes, a bass so deep it seemed to resonate in my bones, children's voices weaving through the adult chorus like silver threads. As the hymn ended, I heard the unmistakable sound of a full congregation settling into pews, the rustle of clothing, quiet coughs, the soft murmur of voices. Then came the familiar cadence of Latin Mass, spoken by a priest with a voice full of authority and warmth. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. I crept closer, my logical mind warring with what I was witnessing. The church was clearly occupied. I could see shadows moving past the windows, hear the responses of the congregation, smell incense drifting on the winter air. But there were no footprints in the snow around the building, no vehicles, no sign of how anyone could have arrived. At 12:30, driven by curiosity and professional duty, I approached the front doors. They were massive things, carved with scenes from the Passion of Christ and fitted with iron hinges that looked medieval. I pressed my ear against the wood and could hear everything perfectly. The priest's sermon about hope in darkness, the congregation's murmured amens, the shuffle of people kneeling and standing. Gathering my courage, I tried the door handle. It was locked, but as my hand touched the cold iron, something extraordinary happened. The voices inside stopped instantly, as if someone had thrown a switch. The light in the windows flickered once and went out. I stood in complete darkness and silence, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air, and realized I was no longer alone. The presence behind me was unmistakable. The sensation of being watched by unseen eyes, the weight of attention focused entirely on me. I turned slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs, and saw nothing but snow-covered ruins and stark winter trees. Yet the feeling persisted, stronger now, as if dozens of invisible observers surrounded me in the darkness. "You shouldn't be here," came a voice, soft but carrying clearly across the silence. I spun toward the sound and saw him, an elderly man in priest's vestments, standing between two crumbling headstones about 20 feet away. His cassock was old-fashioned, the style worn in the early 1900s, and despite the sub-zero temperature, he cast no visible breath in the air. "Father," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "I'm Father Morrison, diocesan investigator. I was sent to—" "I know who you are," the figure interrupted, stepping closer. In the starlight I could see his face clearly now, gaunt, with deep-set eyes that held infinite sadness. "I'm Father Matthias Blackwood. I was the pastor here when—" he gestured vaguely toward the church. "When we chose to stay." The temperature around me seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "Chose to stay? Father, that's impossible. The parish records show the church was abandoned in 1903. A sad smile crossed his weathered features. "Abandoned by the living, yes. But some duties transcend death, Father Morrison. Some congregations are bound by more than just faith." As he spoke, other figures began to emerge from the shadows. Men, women, children, all dressed in the clothing of a century past. They gathered around us in a loose circle, their faces pale but peaceful, their eyes fixed on me with a mixture of hope and sorrow. "The diphtheria," Father Blackwood continued, his voice growing distant with memory. "It took everyone, every last soul in Grimhaven. But we are a faithful community. When death came for us, we made a choice. Rather than move on to whatever judgment awaited, We decided to remain here, to continue our worship, to keep the light burning in this dark corner of the world. I stared at the gathered figures, my theological training struggling to process what I was witnessing. But why? Why choose to stay trapped on earth when heaven awaits? A young woman stepped forward, a child of perhaps 6, clinging to her skirts. Because someone needs to keep watch, Father. This place, these mountains, they hold more than just our village's dead. There are things buried in the deep caves beneath us, things that sleep fitfully and dream terrible dreams. Our prayers, our faithful vigil, they keep those dreams from bleeding into the waking world. The pieces began falling into place. I'd read reports of strange phenomena throughout this region, unexplained disappearances, sightings of creatures that shouldn't exist, areas where compasses spun wildly and electronic devices failed without reason. The church had always attributed these to natural magnetic anomalies and overactive imaginations. "Your guardians," I whispered. Father Blackwood nodded. "For 91 years we've maintained our vigil. Every night we gather to pray, to sing, to strengthen the spiritual barrier that keeps the darkness contained. But we grow weary, Father Morrison. Our faith remains strong, but our connection to this world grows thinner with each passing year." "What are you asking of me?" The congregation began to murmur among themselves, their voices creating a sound like wind through autumn leaves. A young man, barely out of his teens, spoke up. "We're not asking anything. We're offering you a choice. You can walk away, report that you found nothing unusual, and let us continue our watch until we fade completely. Or you can help us find a new way," the woman with the child finished. "There are others like us, Father. Other villages, other congregations that chose duty over rest. If someone could organize us, coordinate our efforts, we might finally be able to rest, knowing the watch continues." The weight of their request settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. They were asking me to become a liaison between the living and the dead, to help establish a network of spiritual guardians across New England. It was beyond anything the church had ever dealt with, beyond anything I'd been trained for. "I need time to think," I said finally. Father Blackwood smiled, and for the first time there was real warmth in his expression. "Of course, but know this, if you choose to help us, you'll never be the same. Once you've seen behind the veil, once you know what really lurks in the dark places of the world, ignorance is no longer an option." The congregation began to fade as he spoke, becoming translucent in the starlight. "Return here on Christmas Eve if you decide to help. We'll be waiting." Within moments, I stood alone in the snow, the silence of the mountain winter pressing down on me like a weight. The 3 days between my encounter at St. Bartholomew's and Christmas Eve passed in a blur of research, prayer, and sleepless nights. I scoured the diocesan archives, looking for any mention of similar phenomena in other abandoned parishes. What I found chilled me to the bone. There were dozens of reports scattered across New England, dating back over a century. Villages where congregations had supposedly died out, but where locals still reported hearing hymns on certain nights. Churches where candles were found lit, despite being locked and empty for decades. Rural communities where the church bells still rang the hours long after the bell ringer had died. Each report had been filed away and forgotten, dismissed as local folklore or natural phenomena. But reading them with new eyes, I saw the pattern. These weren't random hauntings or residual spiritual energy. They were organized, purposeful, part of something much larger than any single congregation. On Christmas Eve, I made my choice. I returned to Grimhaven as the sun set, my pack loaded with supplies I hoped I wouldn't need. The temperature was even colder than before, but this time I felt prepared for what awaited me. At exactly midnight, the church began to glow again, and I walked directly to the front doors. They opened at my approach. Inside, St. Bartholomew's was exactly as it must have been in 1902. The pews were filled with the ghostly congregation, candles burned on every surface, and the altar was set for Christmas Mass. Father Blackwood stood at the pulpit, no longer a translucent figure, but solid and real within the church's sacred space. "You came," he said, his voice carrying easily through the nave. "I did," I replied, walking down the center aisle as the congregation watched. "And I have a proposal." Over the next hour, I outlined my plan. Using my position within the church hierarchy, I would establish a new department, officially called the Historical Preservation Society, but actually dedicated to coordinating the efforts of supernatural congregations across New England. We would create a network, share information about threats and disturbances, and ensure that when one group of guardians finally found rest, others would be ready to take their place. The living and the dead, working together, I concluded. "A true communion of saints." The congregation murmured approval, but Father Blackwood looked troubled. "There would be a price, Father Morrison. To fully join our network, to communicate with us regularly, you would need to change. Part of you would need to exist in our realm, while part remained in yours." "What kind of change?" He gestured to the altar, where a simple wooden cup sat beside the communion wine. "A sip from the chalice of the in-between. It would allow you to see us clearly, to hear our calls for help, to coordinate our efforts, but you would also see other things, the creatures we guard against, the dark spaces between reality, the true scope of what threatens the world, and you could never fully return to ordinary life." I stared at the cup, understanding the magnitude of what he was offering. To accept would mean abandoning any hope of a normal priesthood, of serving a regular congregation, of living an ordinary life. I would become something between living and dead, forever walking the line between worlds. But I thought of the young woman with her child, of the dedication that had kept these souls bound to earth for nearly a century, of the darkness they held back through faith alone. I thought of all the other congregations scattered across New England, standing vigil in forgotten churches and abandoned villages. "I accept," I said, reaching for the chalice. The wine was ice cold and tasted of communion bread and grave earth. As I swallowed, the world around me shifted. Colors became more vivid, sounds clearer, and I could see threads of light connecting every person in the congregation, extending out through the walls toward other distant points of illumination. "Welcome to the network," Father Blackwood said, clasping my shoulder. "Welcome to the true church militant." That was 30 years ago. Since then, I've helped coordinate the efforts of 47 supernatural congregations across 6 states. I've witnessed the binding of things that would drive ordinary men insane, and I've helped peaceful souls finally find rest when their watch was complete. The church knows nothing of my real work. Officially, I study historical preservation and folklore documentation. But the real preservation I do is far more important than anyone realizes. Every night, I receive reports through dreams and visions from my network of ghostly priests and phantom congregations. Every day, I work to ensure that the barriers between our world and the hungry darkness beyond remain strong. And every Christmas Eve, I return to St. Bartholomew's to celebrate midnight mass with the congregation that chose duty over paradise, reminding myself why some sacrifices are worth making for eternity. If these stories are making you question everything you thought you knew about abandoned places, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because we're only halfway through these terrifying encounters and the most disturbing tales are still to come. Now get ready, let's start story 3, and if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. The call came on a Tuesday morning in September 1995, piercing through the mundane routine of my office at the diocesan headquarters in Richmond. The voice on the other end belonged to Sheriff Coleman, a man I'd worked with before on cases involving vandalism at rural churches. "Father Kellison," he said, his usually steady voice carrying an undertone of unease. "We've got a situation out in Ashwood that's got me stumped. No crime's been committed technically, but Well, I think you need to see this yourself. Ashwood Sanctuary had been abandoned since 1973, when a mysterious fire swept through the village during the height of summer, consuming every building except the stone church. The official investigation concluded it was a case of spontaneous combustion caused by an exceptionally dry season. But locals whispered darker theories. They spoke of strange lights seen dancing through the forest in the weeks before the fire, of animals found dead in perfect circles around the village perimeter, of children who claimed to hear voices calling their names from the empty houses. The drive to Ashwood took me through some of Virginia's most beautiful countryside, rolling hills covered in forests just beginning to show their autumn colors. But as I turned onto the gravel road leading to the village, the landscape seemed to change. The trees grew taller and closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the sunlight. The air grew thick and humid, carrying the persistent scent of old smoke, despite the fire being over 20 years past. When I reached Ashwood, I understood immediately why Sheriff Coleman had called me. The village was exactly as it had been left the day after the fire, a collection of charred foundations and twisted metal, overgrown with weeds and saplings. But the church stood untouched, its grey stone walls unmarked by flame, its stained glass windows intact and gleaming in the filtered sunlight. Sheriff Coleman was waiting for me in the church doorway, his hat in his hands and a bewildered expression on his weathered face. "It started 3 days ago," he said without preamble. "Mrs. Henderson was driving past on her way to visit her sister, and she saw lights inside the church, figured it might be kids or vandals, so she called it in. I followed him inside, and my breath caught in my throat. The interior of the church was exactly as it would have been during active use. Wooden pews arranged in neat rows, candles burning steadily on the altar, and everywhere, covering every available surface, were icons. Hundreds of them, depicting saints and biblical scenes in the Byzantine style, their golden halos catching and reflecting the candlelight. But something was wrong with the icons. They were all burned. Not destroyed, not damaged beyond recognition, but deliberately and artistically burned. The flames seemed to have been applied with surgical precision, creating shadows and depth that made the painted figures appear almost three-dimensional. The burning had enhanced rather than destroyed the artwork, giving each saint an otherworldly, luminous quality that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. "No sign of break-in," Sheriff Coleman continued, his voice echoing in the sacred space. "Doors were locked tight, same as they've been for 22 years. But every morning for the past 3 days, we've found new icons appeared overnight, always burned like this, always positioned perfectly, as if someone spent hours arranging them." I approached the altar, where the largest icon dominated the space behind the cross. It depicted Christ in majesty, but the flames had transformed his traditional serene expression into something that looked almost expectant. His eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, and I could swear I saw the faintest movement in the painted flames that surrounded his figure. "Has anyone been here at night?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Sheriff Coleman shook his head. "That's the thing, Father. We've had deputies watching the place since Mrs. Henderson called. Nobody comes or goes, but every morning there's more icons. And the candles, they never burn down. Been burning for 3 days straight now, and they're still the same height they were when we first found them." I spent the next hour examining the icons more closely, and what I discovered defied explanation. Each one was painted on wooden panels that showed clear signs of age. Some appeared to be centuries old, with paint crackers and wood darkening that couldn't be faked. But the burn patterns were fresh, the edges of the flame marks still sharp and clean. More disturbing were the subjects of the paintings. While many depicted traditional saints and biblical scenes, others showed figures I didn't recognize. Saints with no names, performing miracles in landscapes that didn't look quite earthly. and in several of them I could swear I recognized faces from old photographs I'd seen of Ashwood's residence. "I need to stay here tonight," I told Sheriff Coleman. Sheriff Coleman looked like he wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have convinced him. "I'll have a deputy parked outside," he said finally. "Radio if you need anything, but Father, be careful. This place feels wrong in a way I can't put my finger on." As evening fell, I prepared for what might be the longest night of my life. I'd brought my portable altar kit, holy water, and every prayer book I owned. But looking around at the hundreds of burned icons watching me from every surface, I felt woefully unprepared for whatever was about to unfold. The sun set completely around 8 o'clock, and that's when the real strangeness began. The candles, which had been burning steadily all day, suddenly flared brighter, casting dancing shadows that made the icon figures seem to move and shift. The temperature in the church began to rise noticeably, as if invisible fires were burning in the walls themselves. At 9:30, I heard the first sound, a soft scratching like brush strokes on wood. I followed the noise to a corner near the altar, where an easel had appeared, seemingly from nowhere. On it sat a blank wooden panel, and floating in the air beside it was a paintbrush, moving with deliberate strokes to create the outline of a human figure. I watched, transfixed, as the invisible artist worked. The brush moved with inhuman speed and precision, laying down colors that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Within minutes, a face began to emerge. A woman's face, beautiful but marked with profound sadness. As the painting neared completion, I realized with a shock that I recognized her. It was Sarah Mitchell, the village schoolteacher who had died in the fire. But this Sarah was different from the photographs I'd seen. In the icon, she wore robes of deep blue and gold, and her hands were positioned in the traditional gesture of prayer. Most remarkably, a halo of actual flame flickered around her head. Not painted, but real fire that danced without consuming the wood beneath it. "You see us as we truly are now," came a voice, soft and feminine, seeming to emanate from the icon itself. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, as Sarah's painted lips moved with the words, "The fire didn't destroy us, Father. It transformed us." "Sarah," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The painted figure nodded, and I noticed that other icons throughout the church were beginning to stir. Saints I'd thought were traditional depictions were moving their heads to look at me, and I realized with growing amazement that they weren't ancient religious figures at all. They were the people of Ashwood, painted as they had become after the fire. "We were chosen," Sarah continued, her voice now joined by others as more icons came to life. "The village was built on sacred ground, a place where the veil between worlds was always thin. When the fire came, it wasn't destruction, it was consecration. We were transformed into something between human and divine, guardians of a threshold that others cannot see." I looked around the church with new eyes and gradually became aware of something I'd missed before. The building wasn't just sitting on ordinary ground, it was positioned over what appeared to be a natural focal point of spiritual energy. I could see it now. Lines of light converging beneath the altar, creating a nexus that pulsed with otherworldly power. "What threshold?" I asked. "What are you guarding?" An icon of an elderly man, Pastor William Hayes, according to the brass nameplate that had appeared beneath the frame, answered, "The passage between the world of flesh and the realm of pure spirit. There are things on the other side that would use this crossing to enter our reality. Ancient things, hungry things that view human souls as sustenance." As if summoned by his words, the air in the church suddenly grew cold, despite the heat radiating from the icons. The candle flames bent at impossible angles, and shadows began moving independently of their sources. I could sense something pressing against the boundaries of reality, something vast and alien trying to force its way through. The icons began to glow brighter, their painted flames becoming real fire that spread across their surfaces without consuming them. The transformed villagers raised their painted hands in gestures of warding and protection, and their voices rose in a harmony that was part hymn, part incantation. "Stand with us, Father," Sarah called out. "Lend us your faith. The barrier weakens at midnight, and we need all the spiritual strength we can gather." I checked my watch, 11:47 p.m. 13 minutes until whatever was trying to break through would make its strongest attempt. Around me, the church filled with blazing light as every icon became a torch of sacred fire, and I understood that I was witnessing something unprecedented. The active intervention of souls who had chosen to become something beyond human to protect the world from forces beyond imagination. As midnight approached, the very air in the church began to vibrate with tension. The icons blazed like stars, their painted flames now roaring with actual fire that cast no heat but filled the space with brilliant, cleansing light. I could feel the presence on the other side of the threshold growing stronger, pressing against whatever barrier kept it contained. "Take my hand, Father," Sarah's icon commanded, extending a painted arm that somehow became flesh and blood as it reached toward me. I grasped it without hesitation, and immediately felt a surge of power flow through me, not my own strength, but the combined faith of every soul who had chosen transformation over death. One by one, the other icons extended their hands, creating a chain of spiritual connection that encompassed the entire church. Pastor Hayes, the school teacher Sarah, the village doctor, the blacksmith, children who had died too young, all of them linked together in an unbreakable bond of purpose and faith. "Now you'll see what we protect against," Pastor Hayes said, his painted eyes fixed on a point just above the altar. "Look, but do not let fear break the chain." I followed his gaze and nearly lost my grip on Sarah's hand. The air above the altar was tearing, reality splitting like fabric to reveal something that my mind struggled to process. It was darkness, but darkness with intelligence, with hunger so vast and ancient it made the Grand Canyon seem like a puddle. Tentacles of pure shadow reached through the gap, testing the barriers, seeking purchase in our world. The thing, I couldn't think of it as anything else, had eyes, thousands of them, each one larger than a man and filled with a malevolence that had been growing since before the earth was formed. It spoke without words, its voice echoing directly in my skull. "Let me in, little priest. Let me taste the souls of your flock." The icons responded with a burst of flame so intense I had to close my eyes. When I opened them again, the gap in reality was smaller, but the creature was still pushing through, its alien thoughts scraping against my consciousness like claws on glass. "Your faith, Father!" Sarah shouted over the roar of spiritual combat. "Add your prayer to ours." I began to recite the Lord's Prayer, but the words that came out of my mouth weren't in English or Latin. They were in a language I'd never heard before, syllables that seemed to burn my throat as I spoke them. The other transformed villagers joined in, and our combined voices created a sound that was part song, part weapon. The creature shrieked, a sound that shattered two of the church windows and made my ears ring. Its advance slowed, then stopped, then began to reverse as our prayer weapon drove it back toward the tear in reality. But it wasn't going quietly. Shadows lashed out from the gap, striking at the icons and trying to break our chain of connection. One shadow tentacle wrapped around my wrist, and instantly I was flooded with visions of what would happen if the creature broke through. Cities consumed by living darkness, humanity reduced to livestock for an intelligence so alien that madness would be a mercy, the earth itself transformed into a feeding ground for things that existed beyond space and time. "Hold fast!" Pastor Hayes commanded, and somehow I found the strength to maintain my grip on Sarah's hand despite the agony of the creature's touch. The icons blazed even brighter, their collective faith creating a barrier of pure light that forced the shadows back. The battle lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. Finally, with one last furious shriek, the creature retreated fully through the gap, which sealed itself with a sound like thunder. The church fell silent except for the gentle crackling of the icon flames, and I collapsed to my knees, exhausted but victorious. "It's done," Sarah said, her voice weary but satisfied. "For now. It will try again, of course, it always does, but not for another year." As dawn broke through the windows, the icons began to fade back to their painted state, the flames becoming mere brushstrokes once again. But they weren't the same as before. Now each painting contained a spark of life, a awareness that hadn't been there previously. "Will you help us, Father?" Pastor Hayes asked, as his icons settled back into immobility. "Will you ensure that others know of our vigil, that the church understands what we guard?" I nodded, though I knew the challenge that lay ahead. How do you explain to church authorities that an entire village had chosen to become living icons to guard against cosmic horror? How do you convince bishops and cardinals that some miracles are too dangerous for official recognition? But as I left Ashwood that morning, I carried with me the memory of standing hand in hand with saints who had chosen duty over paradise, and I knew I would find a way to honor their sacrifice, even if it meant walking a path between official doctrine and terrible truth. The icons still burn in Ashwood Sanctuary, and I return every year to stand vigil with the transformed souls who guard our world from hungers older than creation itself. Now get ready, let's start story 4, and if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. The letter arrived on my desk on a Thursday morning in November 1988, written in the careful script of someone who wasn't used to putting their thoughts on paper. The sender identified himself as Thomas Brennan, a retired construction worker from northern Maine, and his words carried a weight that made my coffee grow cold as I read. "Father," the letter began, "I don't know who else to tell this to, and I'm not even sure you'll believe me. But there's something in the old church at Millfield Crossing that's been waiting 35 years to make a confession, and I think it's driving me insane." Millfield Crossing was a name I vaguely recognized from my seminary days. A lumber town that had thrived in the early 1900s, but died when the forests were depleted and the mill closed down. According to my maps, it was located about 40 miles north of Bangor, accessible only by a logging road that might or might not still be passable. Brennan's letter continued. "I was part of the crew that boarded up the church back in '53, after the last family moved away. We sealed it tight, doors, windows, everything, but every few years I'd drive out there just to check on things, make sure kids hadn't broken in or anything. For 30 years, everything was fine. But 3 months ago, something changed." He described hearing voices coming from inside the sealed church, always the same pattern. A man's voice speaking in the cadence of confession, pausing as if listening to responses that Brennan couldn't hear, then continuing with what sounded like deep, soul-wrenching guilt. The voice spoke for exactly 15 minutes every night at 9 p.m., then fell silent until the next evening. "I know how it sounds," the letter concluded, "but I've heard it 43 nights in a row. Always the same voice, always the same time. Father, I helped board up that church myself. There's no way anyone could be inside, but someone is in there, and they need help that's beyond anything I can give." Against my better judgment, I found myself driving north 3 days later, following increasingly rough roads deeper into Maine's wilderness. The autumn had been harsh that year, and snow was already beginning to accumulate in the deep woods. By the time I reached what remained of Millfield Crossing, the sun was setting, and the temperature was dropping fast. The town was exactly what I'd expected. A collection of collapsed buildings, slowly being reclaimed by the forest, their foundations crumbling under the weight of fallen trees and accumulated debris. But the church, as Brennan had indicated, was in remarkable condition. It was a simple wooden structure, painted white though the color had faded to gray, with a small bell tower that stood straight and true despite decades of neglect. More importantly, it was completely sealed. Heavy boards covered every window, and the main door was not only boarded over, but secured with a padlock that showed significant rust and weathering. If someone was inside, they hadn't entered through any conventional means. I checked my watch, 8:47 p.m. If Brennan was right, I had 13 minutes to wait. I positioned myself near the front steps, pulled my coat tighter against the cold, and settled in to see if 35 years of construction experience had driven an honest man to madness. At exactly 9 p.m. I heard the voice. It came from inside the church, muffled by the boards and walls, but clearly audible in the still forest air. A man's voice, middle-aged, speaking with the distinctive rhythm of someone in a confessional booth. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been 35 years since my last confession." The voice paused, and in the silence, I could swear I heard another voice responding, older, authoritative, speaking the familiar words of a priest receiving confession. But this second voice was so faint, I couldn't be sure it wasn't just my imagination filling in expected responses. "I killed him," the first voice continued, and my blood ran cold. "Jimmy Morrison, the mill foreman's son. It was an accident. But I killed him just the same. We were up in the bell tower, just boys being boys, and I pushed him. Not hard, not meaning to hurt him, but he fell, Father. He fell and hit his head, and I watched him die." Another pause, another whispered response I couldn't quite hear. Then, "I was 17. I was scared. I moved his body, made it look like he'd fallen from the roof while playing alone. Everyone believed it. His parents, the sheriff, the whole town. They all thought it was just a terrible accident." The confession continued, detailing decades of guilt, of a life lived in fear of discovery, of watching Jimmy Morrison's parents grieve for a son whose death was caused by a secret the speaker had carried for 35 years. As the voice inside the church continued its confession, I found myself creeping closer to the building, pressing my ear against the boards covering the windows. The wood was solid, weathered but intact, showing no signs of recent disturbance. Yet the voice inside was as clear as if the speaker were standing right next to me. "I tried to tell someone once," the man was saying, his voice thick with emotion. "Came here to the church in 1962, 9 years after it happened. But Father Mackenzie had already moved on, and the building was empty. I sat in that confession booth for 3 hours, trying to work up the courage to speak to God directly. But the words wouldn't come. How do you confess murder to empty air?" The pause that followed was longer this time, and in it I heard something that made my skin crawl, the soft creak of wood, as if someone was shifting their weight in an old chair. It was coming from directly behind the wall I was pressed against, from what would have been the location of the confession booth if the church was laid out in a traditional manner. "I've tried to make amends," the voice resumed. "Sent money to his parents anonymously, thousands of dollars over the years, paid for Jimmy's headstone when they couldn't afford a proper one, even named my own son James, though my wife never knew why. But none of it takes away what I did. None of it brings him back. Indeed, I walked around the building, checking every board, every potential entry point. The church was sealed as tight as a tomb, and the ground around it showed no footprints in the early snow except my own. Yet inside, the confession continued with heartbreaking detail. The speaker, who I was beginning to suspect was Thomas Brennan himself, despite his letter suggesting he was only a listener, described a lifetime of nightmares, of seeing Jimmy Morrison's face in every crowd, of jumping at every unexpected knock on the door. He spoke of a marriage that had failed under the weight of his secret guilt, of children who'd grown up wondering why their father was always distant and afraid. "The worst part," Brennan's voice said, "is that I think he's been waiting for me. All these years, I think Jimmy's been waiting for me to tell the truth. Sometimes I dream about him, still 17, standing at the bottom of the bell tower looking up at me. He doesn't look angry, Father. He just looks tired, like he's been waiting a very long time for someone to care enough about him to tell the truth." As the confession reached its climax, something extraordinary began to happen. The air around the church grew warmer despite the October cold, and I could smell something that had no business being there. Fresh flowers, the kind used for church services. The scent was coming from inside the building, drifting through microscopic gaps in the boards. "I'm dying, Father," Brennan continued, his voice now barely above a whisper. "Cancer. The doctors say I have maybe 2 months. I came here tonight because I couldn't bear the thought of taking this secret to my grave. Jimmy Morrison deserves better than that. His parents deserve to know the truth, even if they're both long dead themselves." The response from the unseen priest was clearer now, though still indistinct. I could hear the cadence of Latin prayers, the familiar rhythm of absolution being granted. But underneath those expected sounds was something else. A younger voice, also speaking Latin, joining in the prayers. A voice that sounded like it might belong to a 17-year-old boy. "Thank you," Brennan whispered, and I could hear tears in his voice. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for forgiving me. And Jimmy, God, Jimmy, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I waited so long." The church fell silent, and in that silence I heard one last sound that convinced me I was witnessing something far beyond ordinary experience. From inside the building came the soft squeak of a door opening, followed by footsteps. 2 sets of footsteps, walking together across wooden floors. I pressed my ear harder against the boards, straining to hear more, but the sounds faded into nothing. The warmth in the air dissipated, the scent of flowers disappeared, and I was left standing alone in the cold Maine woods, wondering if I'd just witnessed a man's soul finding peace after 35 years of torment. 15 minutes later, exactly on schedule, the nightly confession ended. But this time, there was no voice promising to return tomorrow night. This time there was only silence. The peaceful, complete silence of a burden finally lifted. I spent the night in my car, parked near the church, waiting to see if the voice would return the following evening. At 9 p.m. exactly, I positioned myself by the building again and listened. Nothing. The church remained silent. Truly silent for the first time in over 2 months. The next morning I drove into Bangor and located the diocesan records office. It took me 3 hours of searching through old files, but I finally found what I was looking for. Records from St. Michael's Church in Millfield Crossing, including the roster of parishioners from the 1950s. Thomas Brennan was listed as a member of the congregation, along with his parents and 3 siblings. More importantly, I found a newspaper clipping from October 15, 1953, reporting the death of James Morrison, age 17, son of mill foreman Patrick Morrison. The article described it as a tragic accident. Young Morrison had apparently fallen from the church roof while attempting to retrieve a ball that had become lodged in the gutters. But there was something else in the file that made my hands shake as I read it. A letter from Father Mackenzie to the bishop, dated 2 weeks after Jimmy Morrison's death. In it, the priest expressed concern about Thomas Brennan, who had been acting strangely since the accident and had asked repeatedly about the seal of confession, specifically whether a priest could absolve someone of a sin they confessed after the priest was no longer alive. "The boy seems deeply troubled," Father Mackenzie had written, "and I fear he blames himself somehow for young Morrison's death. I've tried to counsel him, but he insists that God doesn't hear confessions made to empty air. He seems fixated on the idea that forgiveness can only come through a proper priest, in a proper confessional, with proper rites. I've told him that God's mercy extends beyond such technicalities, but he remains inconsolable." I drove back to Millfield Crossing that afternoon, armed with new understanding. Using tools I'd brought from home, I carefully removed enough boards from one window to gain entry to the church. Inside, I found exactly what I'd expected, a small, simple nave with a confessional booth in the back corner. The booth was old but well constructed, divided into 2 sections by a wooden partition with a small screened opening. I examined both sides carefully and found something that confirmed my suspicions. On the priest's side, carved into the wood with what looked like a penknife, were 2 sets of initials, TB 1953, and below it, in fresher cuts, TB 1988. Thomas Brennan had been coming here for 35 years, trying to make his confession to a priest who was no longer there, and somehow, in the mystery of faith and guilt and overwhelming need for forgiveness, that priest had returned to hear him. I spent an hour in that confessional booth, saying prayers for both Thomas Brennan and Jimmy Morrison, wherever their souls might be. As I prepared to leave, I noticed something that nearly brought me to tears. Fresh flowers on the altar, daisies and carnations that couldn't have been there more than a day or two. Someone had been here recently, someone who cared enough to bring flowers to an abandoned church. The drive back to Bangor gave me time to think about what I'd witnessed and what I should do about it. How do you report that a man spent 35 years confessing to a ghost, and that ghost finally showed up to provide the absolution he needed? How do you explain that the seal of confession apparently extends beyond death itself? I decided to handle it the way Father Mackenzie probably would have, with discretion and compassion. I wrote a letter to the Morrison family, who still lived in the area, explaining that I'd recently learned some information about Jimmy's death that might bring them peace. I told them that Thomas Brennan had carried guilt about the accident for decades, believing he could have prevented it somehow, and that he'd finally found peace by confessing his feelings of responsibility. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was truth enough. Jimmy Morrison's sister wrote back 2 weeks later, thanking me and saying that it helped to know someone had cared so deeply about her brother's death. She also mentioned that fresh flowers had been appearing on Jimmy's grave recently, always daisies and carnations, though no one in the family had been placing them there. A month after my visit to Millfield Crossing, I received a call from the Bangor hospital. Thomas Brennan had died peacefully in his sleep, and in going through his effects, they'd found a letter addressed to me. In it, he thanked me for being there on the night of his final confession, though he didn't explain how he'd known I was outside the church. The letter concluded, "Father, I know you'll probably think I'm crazy, but I swear I saw Jimmy waiting for me when I left the church that night. He looked just like he did when we were 17, and he was smiling. He said he forgave me a long time ago, but he knew I needed to hear it properly. Some confessions, he said, are worth waiting 35 years to receive. Now get ready, let's start story 5, and if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear." The telegram that summoned me to Greystone Abbey arrived on December 3rd, 1991, crackling with urgency despite its formal church Latin. Require immediate assistance. Stop phenomenon beyond ordinary explanation. Stop come prepared for extended stay. Stop Father Antonius Greystone, Abbey, Maine. I knew Father Antonius by reputation, a scholar priest who'd spent 40 years studying medieval monasticism and had been appointed to oversee the restoration of Greystone Abbey, a 14th century monastery that had been abandoned since the Reformation. The fact that he was calling for help meant something significant was happening, something beyond the usual concerns of historical preservation. The drive to Greystone took me deep into Maine's wilderness, following increasingly narrow roads until I reached a gravel track that wound up the side of Mount Katahdin. Snow was falling heavily by the time I reached the abbey, and through the white curtain, the massive stone structure looked like something from another century entirely, which of course it was. Father Antonius met me at the main gate, his elderly frame wrapped in a heavy wool coat that couldn't quite hide the exhaustion in his posture. "Thank God you're here, Father Morrison," he said, gripping my hand with surprising strength. I was beginning to think I'd imagined the whole thing. Inside the abbey's main hall, warmed by a massive fireplace that must have been original to the building, Father Antonius told me his story. The restoration work had been proceeding normally for 2 years, cataloging artifacts, stabilizing walls, documenting the monastery's history. But 3 weeks ago, the workers had made a discovery that changed everything. "We found a chamber," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. hidden behind a false wall in the scriptorium. Inside was a collection of manuscripts that shouldn't exist, texts that were supposedly destroyed centuries ago, writings that the church has declared heretical or dangerous. But that's not the strangest part. He led me through corridors lined with restoration equipment and scaffolding to a heavy oak door marked with symbols I didn't recognize. Beyond it lay a circular chamber carved directly from the mountain stone, its walls covered with shelves holding hundreds of ancient books and scrolls. The manuscripts are in perfect condition, Father Antonius continued, gesturing toward the collection. No deterioration, no damage from moisture or insects. It's as if they've been preserved by some force beyond natural explanation. But more importantly, someone has been reading them. I examined the shelves more closely and saw what he meant. Many of the books showed signs of recent use. Bookmarks made from what looked like fresh parchment, notes written in margins using ink that hadn't had time to fade, pages that lay open as if someone had just stopped reading moments before. The workers refuse to enter this chamber anymore, Father Antonius said. They claim they've seen someone here late at night when the abbey should be empty. A monk in traditional robes, reading by candlelight that casts no heat and leaves no wax drippings. When they try to approach him, he vanishes, but the book he was reading remains open to the exact page where he left off. As if summoned by his words, we heard footsteps echoing from deeper in the chamber. Soft, measured steps, like someone walking in meditation. Father Antonius gripped my arm, his face pale in the flickering light from our electric lanterns. "That's him," he whispered. "That's the monk." We followed the sound deeper into the chamber, past shelves of forbidden knowledge and ancient wisdom. The footsteps seemed to stay just ahead of us, leading us through passages I was certain hadn't been there moments before. The walls were covered with frescoes depicting scenes I didn't recognize. Saints performing miracles that weren't recorded in any scripture I knew. Biblical events that seemed somehow different from their traditional versions. Finally, the footsteps stopped. We found ourselves in a small chapel carved from the living rock, its altar dominated by a statue of a monk holding an open book. The figure was so lifelike I initially thought it was a living person frozen in prayer, but as we approached, I realized it was carved from a single piece of white marble. The book in the statue's hands was real, however, and it was open to a page written in Latin so archaic I had to study it carefully to understand the meaning. It appeared to be an account of the abbey's founding, but the version it told was very different from the official church history. According to this text, Greystone Abbey had been established not just as a monastery, but as a repository for knowledge deemed too dangerous for general circulation. The monks who lived here had been tasked with preserving and protecting texts that contained truths the church wasn't ready to acknowledge. Writings about miracles that bordered on magic, accounts of saints who had transcended normal human limitations, theological treatises that challenged the very foundations of accepted doctrine. "The Guardian," Father Antonius said suddenly, his voice filled with awe. "That's what he is. The last monk of Greystone, still fulfilling his vows to protect this knowledge." As Father Antonius spoke those words, the temperature in the chapel dropped dramatically, and our breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. The candles on the altar, which had been unlit when we entered, suddenly blazed to life with flames that cast brilliant light, but, as the workers had reported, generated no heat whatsoever. Before us, the statue began to change. The marble features softened, took on the appearance of living flesh, and what I had taken for carved robes rustled with the movement of actual fabric. The monk raised his head from the book and looked directly at us with eyes that held centuries of wisdom and unimaginable loneliness. "Father Antonius," the figure said, his voice carrying the weight of ages but remaining surprisingly gentle, "you have done well to call for counsel. The time has come when choices must be made about the knowledge housed within these walls." I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Who are you?" The monk smiled, and in that expression was both infinite sadness and profound peace. "I am Brother Thomas Aquinas Mercator, last keeper of the grey stone collection. I died in the winter of 1534, as the king's men approached to dissolve the monastery. But my vows were for life and beyond, and the knowledge here required protection that transcended mortal existence." He gestured toward the walls around us, and I noticed for the first time that the frescoes were moving, scenes playing out like living pictures. Saints performed impossible miracles, angels walked among ordinary people, and Christ himself appeared in forms that differed subtly but significantly from traditional iconography. "For over 4 centuries I have maintained the collection," Brother Thomas continued. "I have preserved texts that contain truths your modern church is not yet ready to embrace, knowledge that could either elevate humanity to new spiritual heights or destroy faith entirely if misused. But I grow weary, and the world is changing in ways that make my guardianship increasingly difficult." Father Antonius stepped forward, his scholarly excitement overcoming his fear. "The manuscripts we've catalogued, they're authentic. The Gospel of Thomas, the Epistles of Mary Magdalene, the Chronicle of Melchizedek. All authentic," the monk confirmed, "and far more dangerous than you realize. These texts contain accounts of miracles that were suppressed not because they were false, but because they revealed abilities that the early church feared would make people believe they could become divine themselves. The knowledge here could revolutionize Christian theology or shatter it completely." I examined the book in the monk's hands more closely, and as I read, my understanding of church history began to shift. The text described a Christianity very different from what had emerged from the early councils, a faith that embraced mystery and acknowledged that human beings possessed capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. "Why are you showing us this now?" I asked. "Why after centuries of secrecy?" Brother Thomas closed the book and fixed us with a penetrating stare. "Because the barriers between worlds are thinning. Other guardians, other watchers like myself, report increasing incidents of spiritual manifestation. The dead walk more freely, miracles occur more frequently, and the boundary between faith and reality grows ever more permeable. The knowledge in this collection may soon be needed to guide humanity through changes that are coming, whether we're prepared or not." As he spoke, the frescoes on the walls grew more vivid, more active. I could see scenes of spiritual warfare, of angels and demons locked in combat over the souls of humanity. But more disturbing were the images of ordinary people performing feats that defied natural law, healing with touch, walking through walls, communicating across vast distances through thought alone. "The manuscripts describe these abilities," Brother Thomas explained, following my gaze. "They provide instruction in spiritual practices that the church declared heretical, not because they were evil, but because they were too powerful for unprepared minds to handle safely. But the time is approaching when such knowledge may be humanity's only hope for survival." Father Antonius was examining other books now, his face growing pale as he read. "These describe events that haven't happened yet," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. "Prophecies, visions of future spiritual crises that—" He stopped, looking up at Brother Thomas with dawning understanding. "You're not just preserving the past, you're preparing for the future." The monk nodded gravely. "The grey stone collection exists outside normal time. The knowledge here includes not just what was, but what may be. The manuscripts you've found contain warnings about spiritual dangers that are yet to come, and instructions for dealing with them when they arrive." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold in the chamber. "What kind of dangers?" Brother Thomas's expression grew even more serious. "The kind that require the cooperation of the living and the dead to overcome." Brother Thomas led us deeper into the hidden chambers beneath grey stone abbey, through passages that seemed to extend far beyond what the mountain should have been able to contain. The walls here were covered with maps, not of earthly geography, but of spiritual territories, showing the locations of other hidden repositories, other guardians, other places where the boundary between worlds was thin enough to allow communion between the living and the dead. There are 12 primary sites, he explained, his finger tracing lines of connection between various points on the mystical maps. Monasteries, churches, even some locations that appear to be simple ruins, but house guardians like myself. We form a network, a web of protection that spans the globe. But the network is weakening. He stopped before a map that showed North America, marked with glowing points of light. Several of the lights were dim, and as I watched, one flickered and went out entirely. Guardian sites that have lost their keepers, Brother Thomas said sadly. When a guardian finally succumbs to the pull of eternity, if no replacement has been prepared, the knowledge and protection they provided is lost forever. In the past century, we've lost 4 major repositories. If we lose 3 more, the network will collapse entirely. What happens then? Father Antonius asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. Then the barriers fail, Brother Thomas replied. The spiritual protections that have kept certain entities contained begin to crumble. Knowledge that was hidden for good reason becomes accessible to those who would misuse it, and humanity faces a crisis of faith and reality that could tear apart the very fabric of existence. I studied the map more carefully, noting the locations of the remaining active sites. You're asking us to become guardians ourselves, aren't you? To take on the responsibility you've carried for 4 centuries. Brother Thomas smiled, and for the first time there was hope in his expression. Not to replace me, not yet, but to help expand the network, to train others, to ensure that when my time finally comes, the knowledge here doesn't die with me. The world is changing, Father Morrison. The old ways of hiding and protecting are no longer sufficient. We need guardians who can operate in the modern world, who understand both ancient wisdom and contemporary realities. He led us to a chamber I hadn't seen before, one filled with what appeared to be modern equipment, computers, communication devices, even satellite phones. But as I looked closer, I realized the technology had been modified in ways I couldn't understand, inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and change when I looked at them directly. Technology enhanced with spiritual resonance, Brother Thomas explained, noticing my confusion. The knowledge preserved here includes not just ancient wisdom, but understanding of how spiritual forces interact with modern innovations. These devices allow communication with other guardian sites, even across the boundaries between life and death. He activated one of the modified computers, and the screen displayed a network diagram showing connections to locations around the world. Green dots indicated active guardian sites, yellow showed sites with weakening protection, and red marked locations where the guardian network had already failed. The situation is worse than I initially revealed, Brother Thomas admitted, his expression grave. 3 more sites have gone dark in the past month alone. Something is actively hunting guardians, something that understands our network and is systematically dismantling it. The screen flickered, and suddenly we were looking at security footage from what appeared to be an abandoned church. A figure in dark robes moved through the building, but something was wrong with its movements. It seemed to phase in and out of visibility, and where it walked, shadows lingered long after it had passed. The Shadow Walker, Brother Thomas said, his voice tight with fear I hadn't heard before. An entity that exists in the spaces between worlds, feeding on spiritual energy and growing stronger with each guardian it destroys. It's been dormant for centuries, but something has awakened it. Father Antonius leaned closer to the screen. How do we fight something like that? By doing what guardians have always done, Brother Thomas replied. By working together, combining our strengths, and using knowledge that others fear to touch. But first, you must decide if you're truly willing to accept this responsibility. Once you become part of the Guardian network, your lives will never be the same. You'll see things that will challenge every assumption you have about reality, faith, and the nature of existence itself. I looked around the chamber at the impossible technology and ancient wisdom existing side by side, at the maps showing spiritual territories that official church doctrine insisted didn't exist. Then I thought about the other stories I'd encountered in my career. The villages where the dead still walked, the churches where impossible things happened nightly, the growing number of reports that suggested the boundaries between worlds were indeed thinning. What exactly would we need to do? I asked. Brother Thomas smiled and gestured toward a shelf lined with manuscripts bound in what looked like human skin. Learn, study, prepare. The knowledge in these texts will train you to see beyond the veil, to communicate with entities from other realms, to protect spiritual sites from forces that most people can't even imagine. But more importantly, you'll help us identify and train others. The network needs to expand from 12 sites to dozens, perhaps hundreds, if we're going to survive what's coming. The computer screen changed again, showing what appeared to be a live feed from somewhere in Europe. A cathedral was burning, but the flames were black and seemed to move with intelligence, consuming not just physical matter, but something more fundamental, the very spiritual essence of the sacred space. The Shadow Walker's work, Brother Thomas confirmed, it's not just destroying guardians, it's corrupting the sites themselves, turning places of power into wounds in reality. If it continues unchecked, eventually there will be nowhere left for humanity to hide when the real invasion begins. Invasion, Father Antonius whispered. Brother Thomas closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they held the weight of prophecies too terrible to contemplate. The entities we guard against, the knowledge we keep hidden, they exist for a reason. Beyond the boundaries of our reality lies a realm populated by things that view our world as a feeding ground. The only thing that has kept them at bay for millennia is the network of guardians and the spiritual barriers we maintain. If those defenses fall, he didn't need to finish the sentence. The implications were clear enough. I made my decision. Tell us what we need to do. Brother Thomas nodded, his relief evident. Then let your education begin. But be warned, once you've read these texts, once you've seen what they reveal, you can never return to the comfortable ignorance of ordinary faith. You'll know that the universe is far stranger, far more dangerous, and far more wondrous than the Church teaches. Are you prepared for that knowledge? I looked at Father Antonius, saw my own determination reflected in his eyes, and reached for the first manuscript on the shelf. We're ready. As my fingers touched the ancient binding, the world around me shifted. Reality tilted, and I began to understand just how little I had known about the true nature of existence. The education of a guardian had begun, and there was no turning back. Now get ready. Let's start story 6. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you, because now you're going to die of fear. The phone call that changed my life came at 3:17 a.m. on September 15, 1996. I remember the exact time because I was staring at my bedside clock, wondering why sleep had been eluding me for the past 3 nights. The voice on the other end was that of Sheriff Patricia Walsh from Sorrow Hill, Vermont, a woman I'd never met, but whose desperation was evident in every word. "Father Carmichael," she said without preamble, "I need someone who deals with unusual situations. The state police think I'm losing my mind, but I know what I'm hearing. Every night for 2 weeks, children have been singing in the ruins of St. Agnes School. The problem is, Father, all the children died in 1962. Sorrow Hill had earned its name honestly. Built in a valley that seemed to trap fog and shadows, the town had suffered more than its share of tragedies over the decades. But none compared to the fire at St. Agnes School on November 20th, 1962. 43 children and 6 teachers had perished when faulty wiring sparked a blaze that consumed the 3-story building in less than an hour. The tragedy had broken the community's spirit, and by 1975, the last families had moved away, leaving Sorrow Hill to slowly crumble into nothing. "The singing starts at sunset," Sheriff Walsh continued. her voice strained with exhaustion. Children's voices, clear as anything, singing hymns and Christmas carols. Silent night, angels we have heard on high, Jesus loves me. Beautiful voices, Father, so beautiful it breaks your heart to listen. But when you approach the ruins, the singing stops, and there's nothing there but ash and memories. I'd encountered my share of unexplained phenomena over the years, but something about Sheriff Walsh's description resonated with a deep unease I couldn't shake. Perhaps it was the mention of children's voices, or maybe it was the date. November was approaching, and the anniversary of tragedies often seemed to stir supernatural activity. "I'll be there tomorrow," I told her. The drive to Sorrow Hill took me through some of Vermont's most depressing landscape. Towns that had died when the mills closed, forests that seemed too dark for autumn, and roads that felt like they led nowhere good. As I crested the hill overlooking the valley, I understood immediately why the place had been abandoned. There was something oppressive about the very air, a weight that pressed down on the soul and made hope seem like a foreign concept. Sheriff Walsh met me at what had once been the town limits, her patrol car parked beside a sign so weathered the town name was barely legible. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, but her eyes held the haunted look of someone who'd seen too much. "Thank you for coming," she said, shaking my hand with a grip that spoke of determination and fear in equal measure. I was starting to think I was the only one who could hear them. She led me through the remains of Sorrow Hill's main street, past collapsed houses and buildings reclaimed by aggressive vegetation. At the far end of town, on a small rise that must have once offered a pleasant view of the valley, stood the ruins of St. Agnes School. The fire had been thorough in its destruction. Only the brick foundation and a few walls remained, creating a skeletal outline of what had once been a place of learning and laughter. Weeds grew through the broken concrete, and the metal skeleton of what might have been playground equipment stood rusted and silent in the late afternoon light. "It starts right at sunset," Sheriff Walsh said, checking her watch. 6:43 every single night. I've timed it. We positioned ourselves about 50 yards from the ruins and waited. The silence in the valley was profound. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, even the wind seemed to avoid this place. As the sun touched the horizon and shadows began to creep across the ruins, I found myself holding my breath. At exactly 6:43 p.m., the singing began. It started softly, just a few young voices humming a melody I recognized as "How Great Thou Art." Gradually, more voices joined in, creating a harmony so pure and beautiful it brought tears to my eyes. These weren't just children singing. These were children who had been trained, voices that had been shaped by years of practice and devotion. "Silent night, holy night," they sang in perfect unison, their voices carrying across the valley with impossible clarity. "All is calm, all is bright." I stood transfixed, listening to voices that had been silenced 34 years ago, children who had died in terror and smoke now singing with the joy of angels. But as the sheriff had warned, the moment I took a step toward the ruins, the singing stopped abruptly, leaving only the echo of their final note hanging in the air. "They've been doing this every night," Sheriff Walsh whispered. "The same songs, the same time, the same beautiful voices. But Father, that's not the strangest part." Sheriff Walsh led me closer to the ruins as darkness settled over the valley. 3 nights ago, I finally worked up the courage to stay and listen to the entire performance, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It lasted exactly 47 minutes, the same amount of time it took for the fire to consume the building. And at the end, they sang something I'd never heard before. She pulled out a small digital recorder from her jacket pocket. I managed to capture the last few minutes before they stopped. The device crackled to life, and through the static, I heard the unmistakable sound of children's voices raised in song. But this wasn't a hymn or Christmas carol. This was something else entirely. A haunting melody sung in Latin, words I recognized from funeral masses, but arranged in a way I'd never heard before. Requiem aeternam dona eis Domine, the young voices sang with heartbreaking beauty. Et lux perpetua luceat eis. Grant them eternal rest, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. But there was something more in the recording, something that made my skin crawl. Beneath the children's voices, barely audible, was another sound. The crackle of flames, the sound of wood splintering, and worst of all, adult voices calling out in panic and desperation. It's like they're reliving it, Sheriff Walsh said, her face pale in the gathering darkness. Every night, they sing their Christmas concert, just like they were supposed to on November 21st, 1962. The concert that never happened because they died the night before. I examined the ruins more carefully, using my flashlight to illuminate the foundation where the school's main hall would have been. Among the weeds and debris, I could make out patterns in the concrete, scorch marks that had somehow survived 34 years of weather, outlining where desks had stood, where a piano had been positioned, where children had gathered for their final assembly. There's something else, Sheriff Walsh continued, her voice growing even more strained. I've been researching the fire, trying to understand why this is happening now. The official report said it was an electrical fire, started in the basement and spread too quickly to contain, but I found something in the old police files that was never released to the public. She handed me a manila folder, its contents yellowed with age. Inside were crime scene photographs from the day after the fire, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The bodies of the children hadn't been found scattered throughout the building, as you might expect from people fleeing a fire. They had been discovered in the main hall, arranged in neat rows, as if they'd been seated for a performance. They didn't try to escape, I said, the horrific implications sinking in. The teachers' bodies were found at the exits, Sheriff Walsh confirmed. It looks like they died trying to get out, but the children, it's like they stayed in their seats, waiting for something. The fire chief at the time noted it in his private files, but never made it public. He thought it would be too disturbing for the families. As we studied the photographs, the temperature around us began to drop noticeably. Our breath started to mist in the air, and I could smell something that had no business being there. Fresh flowers, the kind used for school performances, mixed with the acrid scent of old smoke. They're coming back, Sheriff Walsh whispered. This time, I was ready. Instead of retreating when the singing began, I walked directly into the ruins, following the sound to its source. The children's voices grew louder as I approached, but they didn't stop. If anything, they seemed to welcome my presence. Standing in what had been the center of the main hall, I closed my eyes and let the music wash over me. "O come, all ye faithful," flowed into Angels from the Realms of Glory, which blended seamlessly into the first knoll. These children had been preparing for the most important performance of their young lives, and death had denied them their moment to shine. Then I saw them, translucent at first, like heat shimmer on summer pavement, but gradually becoming more solid. 43 children in their Sunday best, arranged in perfect chorus formation just as they would have been for their Christmas concert. Their faces glowed with the joy of young performers sharing their gift, unmarked by the tragedy that had claimed them. At their center stood a woman I recognized from the newspaper accounts, Sister Mary Catherine, the music teacher who had died trying to evacuate her students. She conducted the invisible choir with movements that were both graceful and heartbreaking, her face radiant with pride in her young singers. "Father," she said, her voice cutting through the music without interrupting it, "we've been waiting so long for someone to hear our concert. We practiced so hard, worked so diligently. We were going to sing the Christmas story to bring joy to our families and community." The children continued singing, their voices pure and clear, untouched by the decades that had passed since their deaths. And I realized that this wasn't a haunting in any traditional sense. This was a completion, a performance that needed to happen before these souls could find peace. As the ethereal concert continued, I found myself becoming part of something far more profound than a simple supernatural encounter. The children's choir wasn't just singing. They were telling the story of Christmas through music, each song building on the last to create a narrative of hope, redemption, and eternal love. Sister Mary Catherine approached me while her students continued their performance, her form becoming more solid with each passing moment. "Father, we need your help to finish this properly," she said, her voice carrying the authority of a teacher accustomed to being obeyed. "A Christmas concert isn't complete without the blessing of the church. We've been waiting 34 years for a priest to hear our offering and declare it acceptable to God." I understood then what was being asked of me. These children and their devoted teacher had died one day before their scheduled performance, their months of preparation rendered meaningless by tragedy. They couldn't move on to whatever awaited them until they had completed their earthly mission, to share the joy of Christmas through their voices. "What do you need me to do?" I asked. Sister Mary Catherine smiled, and in that expression was both profound gratitude and infinite patience. "Listen to our complete program, Father. Bear witness to our devotion and preparation, and when we finish, give us the blessing we would have received from Father Kowalski, who was supposed to attend our concert." I nodded, taking my place at what would have been the front row of the audience. Sheriff Walsh had followed me into the ruins and stood nearby, her face filled with wonder as she watched the ghostly performance unfold. The children sang for nearly an hour, their repertoire including traditional carols, classical pieces I recognized from my own youth, and several songs I'd never heard before, but which seemed somehow familiar. Their voices blended with supernatural perfection, creating harmonies that no earthly choir could achieve. But it was more than just their technical skill that moved me to tears. These children sang with a joy that transcended death itself, a pure love for music and for the Christmas story they were telling. Each song was a gift, offered with the enthusiasm and innocence that only children possess. As the concert neared its end, something remarkable began to happen. The ruins around us started to change, becoming less substantial while simultaneously growing more real. I could see glimpses of the school as it had been, decorated halls, classrooms filled with Christmas projects, a main hall set up for the performance with folding chairs and a small stage. "Our final song," Sister Mary Catherine announced, raising her conductor's baton, "is one we wrote ourselves, Father. We wanted to offer something original, something that came from our hearts rather than from a hymnal." The children's voices rose in a melody I'd never heard, but which seemed to capture the essence of Christmas itself. The words were simple, the kind that children would write, but they held a power that made the air around us shimmer with divine presence. Jesus came to us as a baby, small and mild, born to show us love through the heart of a child. When we sing his story, when we raise our voice, heaven hears our music and angels rejoice. As they sang, I became aware that we weren't alone. The ruins filled with translucent figures, parents, siblings, community members who had planned to attend the concert that never was. They sat in invisible chairs, their faces shining with pride and love as they watched the children perform. When the final note faded into the Vermont night, a profound silence settled over the ruins. The children looked expectantly at Sister Mary Catherine, who turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Father," she said softly, "would you bless our offering?" I stepped forward, drawing on every blessing I'd ever learned, every prayer I'd ever offered. "Heavenly Father," I began, my voice carrying clearly in the supernatural stillness, "we thank you for the gift of these young voices raised in praise of your Son's birth. Accept their offering of music, made with pure hearts and devoted spirits. Let their joy in singing your glory be a bridge between earth and heaven, a reminder that innocence and love are the greatest gifts we can offer." As I spoke the words of blessing, the ghostly audience began to fade, their faces filled with satisfaction and peace. The children's forms became lighter, more translucent, but their smiles grew brighter. "Thank you, Father," Sister Mary Catherine whispered, as she too began to fade. "We can rest now. Our concert is complete." One by one, the children waved goodbye, their forms dissolving into points of light that rose into the night sky like musical notes made visible. The last to go was a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6, who ran to me and threw her arms around my waist. "Thank you for listening," she said, in a voice like silver bells. "Music is supposed to be shared, and we've been alone so long." Then she too was gone, leaving only the scent of pine boughs and Christmas flowers hanging in the air. Sheriff Walsh and I stood in the ruins for a long time afterward, both of us changed by what we'd witnessed. The children of St. Agnes School had finally given their Christmas concert, and their voices had been heard by an audience that included both the living and the dead. As we walked back through the abandoned town, I could have sworn I heard one last faint echo of their voices, singing Silent Night, with the joy of souls finally at peace. As these 12 terrifying encounters come to an end, I want you to ask yourself something. After hearing these stories, can you ever look at an abandoned building the same way again? These priests didn't seek out these experiences. They were called to them, drawn by forces beyond their understanding to bear witness to truths that challenge everything we think we know about life, death, and what lies between. If these stories have moved you, if they've opened your eyes to possibilities you never considered, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue uncovering these incredible encounters, and there are more stories out there, more priests with experiences that will change how you see the world. And if you found these tales as compelling as I hope you did, consider sending us super thanks. Your contribution doesn't just support the channel. It helps us reach out to more clergy members who have walked in these shadow places, who have stood at the threshold between worlds and returned with stories that need to be told. The abandoned villages are still out there. The churches still stand empty in forgotten places. And sometimes, just sometimes, they're not as empty as they appear. Subscribe now, because you never know when the next story might find its way to you.